Hey, this is Will, and in this lesson, we will be generating the Kubernetes API Server certificate. To start off, I'm going to make sure that I change directory into my folder where I have all of my Kubernetes certificates so far. And the next thing I need to do is I need to set a variable that I'm going to use to contain the host names that I need in order to sign this certificate. Now, there's going to be a long list of host names and IPs here, and what we need to do is we need to make sure that we sign the certificate with all of the different host names and IPs that we might use in order to access the Kubernetes API. So I'm just going to set a variable here called cert_hostname. The first IP that I'm going to provide is 10.32.0.1, and that's just a standard IP that some pods within the Kubernetes cluster might wind up using in order to access the Kubernetes API internally. That's not an external IP address, that's just an IP address that may be used in some scenarios within the Kubernetes cluster network itself. So I'm just going to put a comma because this is going to be a comma delimited list. And the next thing I'm going to put is the private IP of my first controller node. So I'm going to come over here to my browser and I'm going to go to cloud servers. And here are my cloud servers. And the first two are the ones I'm going to use as my controller nodes. The second set is the worker nodes, and number 6 down here at the bottom is going to be my load balancer. Right now, I want the private IP of my first controller node, and it's important that I make sure that I use the private IP and not the public IP, because the public IP can change, but the private IP will stay the same. So I'm just going to copy that private IP, and I'm going to come back here and I'm going to add that to my list. Then I'll put another comma, and I'm also going to add the host name because it's also possible to access the API using the host name. So I'm just going to copy the host name of my first controller node, and I'll paste that in here as well. Then I'm going to add another comma, and I'm going to add the same values, but for my second controller. So I'll get the private IP of the second controller, and I'll paste that there. And of course, I'll also get the host name of the second controller. So that will allow me to access the Kubernetes API directly on either one of my controller nodes, but most of the time, it's going to be accessed using the load balancer. So I also need to add the load balancer to this list. Otherwise, when I try to access the Kubernetes API through the load balancer, the certificate will not be valid. So in order to make sure the certificate is valid in that scenario, I'm going to get the private IP of server number 6 down here at the bottom, which is going to be my load balancer for the Kubernetes API. So I'll add that one to the list, and of course, I'll also add the host name here. So there's just a few more standard things I need to add to this list. I'm going to add 127.0.0.1, which is the standard IP address for localhost. So there will be scenarios where some of the Kubernetes services that are running on the controller nodes will access the Kubernetes API locally, and they'll use this IP address to do so. So I need to make sure that that is included. And I'm also going to include the actual standard host name of localhost as well. And the final thing I'm going to add to this list is an internal Kubernetes network host name called kubernetes.default, which is kind of similar to this first IP address because kubernetes.default can also be used from inside of the Kubernetes cluster to access the Kubernetes API. So we need to make sure that the certificate is signed appropriately with kubernetes.default as well. So that's all I need to add to this variable. So I'm just going to hit enter to set that cert hostname variable. And now I'm ready to run a command that will generate my Kubernetes API server certificate. And here's my command. And of course, you can find these commands in the description of the video. And I'm creating my certificate signing request and generating my cert. And as you can see, I'm passing in that list of host names. That cert hostname variable is being passed in here for the hostname flag. So I'm just going to execute that command. And if I do an ls, I should now have a Kubernetes key.pem and a Kubernetes.pem. And this is the server certificate that is going to be used to provide TLS, a secure HTTPS connection to the Kubernetes API. So that's all we need to do in order to generate the Kubernetes API server certificate.